and welcome back to This Week in Fantasy LCS, where we look at projected results for Week 8 and past performances. After a break for Super Week, we're back with a new episode. First, let's break down the model I used to create my fantasy estimations. This model is based on two things: the players' points per game this split, and a matchup factor for their upcoming week. To illustrate this model, let's look at Counterlogic Gaming's jungler, Dexter. In the first 7 weeks, he averaged 15.4 points per game. This week, CLG faces TSM and Dignitas. Junglers playing against TSM earned 24% below average, while junglers playing against Dig earned 22% below average. Taking into account his points per game and his matchups, he's expected to get only 23.7 points this weekend, 7 points below his average. First, let's look at top lane, where we see Soaz leading the list last week with his strong 4-0 performance. Fnatic was the only team in both leagues to pull off a 4-0 Super Week, which led them to have a great fantasy performance. A surprise in this list though is Dyrus, who despite going 3-1 in Super Week is near the bottom of the pack. Looking to the estimates for Week 8, Ackerman is at the top despite having a not so easy matchup against Dignitas and Complexity. However, he is the number 1 point scoring top laner in the league right now, averaging over 17 points a match compared to the average 13.7 points per game. Also to note is that Darien and Diamond are being subbed out of Gambit, replaced by Kuban and Lulex respectively. If you for some reason have Darien or Diamond, make sure to bench or drop them, and I would say to stay away from any Gambit players this week despite their easy schedule. My sleeper pick would be Kevin, who despite going against Alliance today, is also going against the Copenhagen Wolves, who give up a lot of points. Next, we'll look at the jungle. Impaler topped the week as Super Hot Crew had a great 3-1 week. Also surprising was Rocket's jungler Jankos, who had a 3-1 week despite being near the bottom of the standings. Sadly, he sat on my bench while I played Crumbs, who had an extremely disappointing week, as he was almost the worst jungler in all of LCS, despite Dig having a 2-2 week. Looking towards this week though, we see Airwalks again at the top of the estimates, as the Wolves face Gambit and Millennium. Despite Copenhagen Wolves' poor fantasy performance in the Super Week, Airwalks still scores on average more than star players like Meteos, Shook, and Dexter. Low on the list is Sven Skaren, who is playing against Rocket and Fnatic, which are two surprisingly stingy fantasy opponents. My sleeper pick this week is again Airwalks. I just picked him up in my own league, so he better do well now. On to mid lane, where we see Selfie crushed it, scoring 111 points, well above anyone else in any position. The surprising thing here is that Selfie's 2 biggest games were on Lulu, busting through the thought that support mids score less points. Lulu actually averages 19 points per game, some of the highest of mid laners. For some other reference points, Ziggs averages 16 points, Orianna averages 15, and Twisted Fate averages 20. Next, let's look at this week's estimates. Bjergsen is near the top, despite his somewhat tough matchup against CLG and C9. This is because he is the second highest point scorer among NA mids, although there are 4 EU mids that surpass him. My sleeper pick is Voyboy. Curse had a great Super Week last week and seems to be on the rise, and their opponents this week are Complexity and EG. So while Curse has been rather lackluster, this should be their week to roll in the points. Now onto AD carries, where Reckless topped the charts. This is his first week topping the AD carry list since we started this show, which is surprising because he's the top point scoring AD carry. Reckless has been a consistently high scorer and is one of the first pick-worthy players that actually came through, compared to people like Meteos. Near the bottom of the charts is I'm a Cutie Pie, who scored very few points despite having the same win-loss as many other teams last week. Looking at the projected list, Woolite is again predicted to be at the top. We covered that they have a good matchup this week, but Copenhagen Wolves is always a gamble. Sneaky, however, is expected to be pretty low on the estimated points as they play EG and TSM this next week. Despite EG being the worst team in NALCS, they don't give up that many points, only 5% above the average team. My sleeper AD carry is Kopp, who's playing against Complexity and EG this week, and his safe playstyle leaves him with low deaths. Looking at support, while Yellowstar scored a ton of points this week, almost as much as Reckless, we see a wider spread of points in the support role. Kasing also had another good week. In his 8 games, he nets the second highest points per game as support behind Yellowstar. Thus, as we look at the expected points, Kasing is near the top, below the support king Yellowstar. Also, while Nif is somewhat near the middle, he might have a big week if Alliance picks up the pieces from last week. They're going against Millennium and Roccat this week, and while it nets them with a negative matchup score, I think they can have a big week. My sleeper support is Kasing, who has really brought a resurgence in Super Haku after they were starting to fall from their strong start. Finally, let's look at the teams, where we see Fnatic and Curse top the charts. Curse had a huge fantasy week because of their long objective-focused games. In a single game, they scored 28 points, which was almost more than their players combined in that low-kill game. Because of this huge week, looking at the estimated points, Curse is at the top. They often have low kill wins, which makes their players score low points, but their team get a lot of points. As such, their team is my sleeper pick this week. If you want to take a closer look at the tables, check out the article. Good luck with your picks, and see you next week.